I stood in the marble-floored lobby of our local bank, the smell of expensive floor wax suddenly making me nauseous as the teller slid a printed statement across the counter with a look of profound pity. Every cent of the $300,000 renovation fund, the legacy my grandmother had left specifically to me, had been drained 48 hours ago, leaving a balance of exactly $4.12. The realization didn't hit me like a wave, it hit me like a landslide, burying me in the terrifying truth that while I was out buying nursery furniture for our future child, the man I had slept next to for 8 years had been signing away my life security to the sister who had spent a decade trying to erase me. The signature on the transfer was a perfect, practiced forgery of my own, but the routing number belonged to a private account in the name of Beatrice Thorne, my sister-in-law. 6 months ago, my life was a tapestry of warm sunlight and the scent of fresh cedar. I was an architect, and my pride and joy wasn't a skyscraper or a museum, but a weathered, salt-stained Victorian cottage on the edge of the cliffs called the Blue Heron. My grandmother, Rose, had left it to me, bypassing my father and his toxic second family. It was a sprawling, stubborn old house with wraparound porches and a view of the Atlantic that could steal the breath from your lungs. To me, it was home. To my husband's family, it was a goldmine of unrealized equity. My husband, Mark, was the kind of man who seemed made of soft edges and gentle reassurances. He was a high school history teacher, or so I thought, with a penchant for old books and a way of tucking my hair behind my ear that made me feel like the only woman in the world. We lived in a cozy apartment in the city, but every weekend was spent at the Heron. I can still see us there, me in my paint-stained overalls, Mark bringing me mugs of steaming Earl Grey, the steam curling into the salt air. He would watch me work on the moldings with a look of what I interpreted as pride. "You're bringing it back to life, Clara," he'd say, his voice thick with a warmth I now know was purely performative. Then there was Beatrice. If Mark was soft edges, his older sister was a razor blade dipped in honey. She was a consultant for high-end real estate, a woman who wore silk blouses that cost more than my monthly mortgage and carried an aura of perpetual dissatisfaction. She had lost her own home in a messy divorce 2 years prior and had been, temporarily, drifting between luxury rentals, all while subtly reminding everyone that the Thorne family had once been the town's elite. Beatrice treated the Heron like it was a family estate that I was merely trespassing on. She would visit unannounced, walking across my newly polished floors in stilettos, her eyes narrowed as she cataloged every upgrade I paid for. "It's such a quaint little hobby for you, Clara," she would purr, her fingers tracing the vintage wallpaper I'd spent weeks sourcing. "But don't you think a modern glass and steel aesthetic would quadruple the resale value? It's a waste to keep it so rustic." I always laughed it off. I thought she was just bitter, a fallen socialite clinging to old pretenses. Mark would always squeeze my hand under the table and whisper, "Ignore her, honey. She's just going through a hard time. You know how she is." I fell for it. I fell for the gentle husband routine so hard that I didn't see the way they looked at each other when they thought I wasn't watching. A look of shared secrets and quiet calculation. The dynamic of our family was best captured at our Sunday dinners. Mark's mother, Evelyn, was a shadow of Beatrice, always nodding in agreement with her daughter's sharpest barbs. One particular evening in late August stands out like a jagged scar in my memory. We were sitting on the Heron's back deck, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the waves in shades of bruised purple and gold. I had just finished the master suite, and I was glowing with the excitement of finally moving in full-time. "I've decided to move the firm's headquarters to the home office here," I announced, pouring more wine for everyone. "We can finally leave the city behind." The silence that followed was heavy. Beatrice didn't congratulate me. She swirled the dark red liquid in her glass, her eyes fixed on the lighthouse in the distance. "It's a very selfish move, isn't it?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. "To lock up such a valuable asset in sentimental value when the family name is struggling. You're playing house in a museum, Clara." "It's my house, Beatrice," I replied, my voice steady despite the sudden chill in the air. "And it's my family's legacy." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She leaned across the table, her face inches from mine, the smell of her expensive perfume cloying and suffocating. "You're a guest here, Clara. A temporary fixture. Honestly, if you vanished tomorrow, no one would notice anything but the vacancy you left behind." She looked around the table, her eyes landing on Mark. He didn't defend me. He didn't tell her she'd gone too far. Instead, he let out a nervous, awkward chuckle, and then, like a row of falling dominoes, Evelyn joined in. The sound of their collective laughter echoed against the cliffs, hollow and cruel. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck, the first real instinct that the floor beneath me wasn't as solid as I believed. "Mark?" I whispered, looking for an anchor. He finally caught my eye, but his gaze was vacant, almost clinical. "Come on, Clara," he said, patting my hand with a touch that felt like ice. "She's just joking. Don't be so sensitive. Besides, B has a point about the market value. We should at least talk about the future." In that moment, the quiet life I had built began to fray at the edges. I didn't see the forgery then. I didn't see the secret meetings or the way Mark was slowly moving our joint files into a locked drawer. I only saw my husband laughing at his sister's joke about my disappearance. I told myself it was just family friction, the kind of petty drama that happens when money and ego collide. I went to bed that night feeling a strange, nagging emptiness, unaware that the woman who had just joked about my vanishing was already working on making it a financial reality. I was still focused on the smell of the cedar and the sound of the ocean, while they were already dividing the spoils of a war I didn't even know had begun. In the weeks that followed that dinner, a strange, suffocating silence settled over our home. It wasn't the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's thoughts. It was a heavy, calculated stillness, like the air before a devastating storm. Mark became a ghost in our own house. He began taking extra shifts at the school that didn't exist on the official calendar, and his phone, once left carelessly on the nightstand, was now an extension of his hand, always face down, always locked with a new passcode I didn't know. The first real tremor of the coming earthquake happened on a Tuesday. I was in the kitchen, sketching out the designs for the Heron's new sunroom, when Beatrice dropped by. She didn't knock, she simply let herself in, her keys jingling with a sound that made my skin crawl. She sat across from me, her eyes scanning my drawings with a clinical, detached interest. "You know, Clara," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the blueprint of the house my grandmother had built with her own sweat. "I was talking to a developer friend of mine. He mentioned that the Heron's lot is actually zoned for multifamily units. If someone were to, say, tear down that drafty old shell, they could put up 4 luxury condos. The profit margin would be astronomical, enough to settle all the Thorne family debts." My heart hammered against my ribs. "The Heron isn't a drafty shell, Beatrice. It's a home, and it's not for sale. Not now, not ever." She just smiled, that thin, predatory smile that never reached her eyes. "Everything is for sale, dear. It's just a matter of who's holding the pen." When I told Mark about the encounter later that night, I expected him to be outraged. I expected him to tell his sister to back off. Instead, he didn't even look up from his laptop. "She's just thinking about the family's future, Clara. You have to admit, we're spread pretty thin. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to look at some appraisals, just to know where we stand?" "Where we stand?" I repeated, the bread I was cutting falling from my hand. "The house is mine, Mark. It's in my name. There is no we when it comes to the Heron's deed." He finally looked at me, and for a split second, I saw something in his eyes I didn't recognize. A flash of resentment so cold it made my blood turn to ice. "Right," he muttered. "Your house, your money, always yours." Then came the lost mail. Important documents from my architectural firm started vanishing. I noticed a letter from the county tax assessor's office half hidden in the bottom of the recycling bin, shredded into tiny, illegible confetti. When I questioned Mark, he laughed it off, saying the dog must have gotten to it, or that he'd accidentally knocked it off the counter. He started asking me strange, circular questions about my grandmother's will, where the original was kept, if there were any contingency clauses I hadn't mentioned. He was gaslighting me so subtly, I began to wonder if I was becoming paranoid. I'd find him standing in the hallway at 2 a.m., staring at the door to our small home office, and when I'd ask what he was doing, he'd just say he couldn't sleep. The breaking point, the moment my world shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, came on a Friday afternoon. Mark had told me he was heading to a teacher's retreat for the weekend. He'd kissed me on the forehead, his lips feeling like dry parchment, and told me to get some rest. 2 hours after he left, I realized he'd forgotten his iPad. It was buzzing incessantly on the coffee table. Normally, I would have ignored it, but a message flashed on the lock screen that stopped my heart. It was from Beatrice. "The notary is set for 4 p.m. Did you get the signature to look right on the quitclaim? If she finds out before the transfer clears, we're dead." The room began to spin. My lungs felt like they were collapsing. With trembling fingers, I tried his usual passcode. It didn't work. I tried his birthday. No. Our anniversary. No. Then, on a whim, I tried Beatrice's birthday. The screen slid open. I didn't find just one message. I found a digital graveyard of my marriage. There were hundreds of emails between them. They had been planning this for months. Beatrice had gambling debts, staggering, life-ruining amounts, and Mark had been borrowing from our joint accounts to keep her afloat, hoping to pay it back before I noticed. But the hole was too deep. Their solution? To steal the only thing I had left of my grandmother, the blue heron. They had drafted a quitclaim deed, transferring the house from my name to a shell company owned by Beatrice. I scrolled further, my eyes blurring with tears, and found the scanned images of the documents. There it was, my signature, a perfect, chilling imitation of my handwriting, scrawled at the bottom of a document that effectively rendered me homeless. The physical reaction was violent. I barely made it to the bathroom before I was retching, my body trying to purge the poison of their betrayal. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped the iPad, the glass cracking across the screen, a perfect metaphor for my life. My pulse was a deafening roar in my ears, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to scream, "Traitor! Traitor! Traitor!" I didn't cry. I couldn't. I felt a strange, terrifying numbness spreading from my chest to my limbs. I grabbed my keys and my coat, not even bothering to lock the front door. I drove to the bank in a trance, the world outside the windshield looking like a blurred, watercolor painting of a life I no longer recognized. And that's when I found myself at the counter, facing the pitying gaze of the teller. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thorne," she said, her voice sounding like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. "The $300,000 transfer was authorized via your digital signature 2 days ago. The account is virtually empty." I stared at the number on the paper. $4.12. The $300,000 I had set aside to fix the Heron's foundation, to keep the house from sliding into the sea, was gone. My husband had sold my soul to save his sister from her own greed. I stood there in the middle of that grand, echoing lobby, and for a moment, I thought I might actually die of a broken heart. The floor felt like it was tilting, the marble rising up to meet me. But then, amidst the nausea and the crushing weight of the theft, something else flickered to life. It was a tiny, white-hot spark of pure, unadulterated rage. They thought I was a temporary fixture? They thought I would just vanish? I gripped the edge of the mahogany counter until my knuckles turned white. My husband was at a retreat that was actually a meeting to finalize the theft of my home. He thought he had left a broken, unsuspecting wife behind. He had no idea that the woman he had just robbed was no longer the girl who believed in soft edges. The Clara who loved him was gone, buried under $4.12 and a forged signature. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of the bank's floor wax no longer making me sick, but sharpening my focus. I didn't need a renovation fund to tear their world down. I just needed to start moving. The drive from the bank to the Blue Heron felt like a journey through a frozen wasteland, even though the afternoon sun was beating down on the asphalt. I didn't feel the heat. I didn't feel the wind from the open window. I only felt the hollow, echoing thud of my heart against my ribs, a reminder that I was still alive, even if the life I knew had been incinerated. I knew exactly where they would be. They wouldn't be at a retreat. They would be at the scene of the crime, savoring the salt air they had just stolen from me. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, the crunch of the stones sounded like breaking bones. There they were, Mark's sensible silver sedan and Beatrice's white convertible, parked side by side like predatory animals at a watering hole. Through the wide front windows of the Heron, the windows I had spent 3 weekends scraping and repainting, I saw shadows moving. I saw the glint of crystal. They were celebrating. I walked to the front door, my legs feeling heavy, as if I were wading through deep water. I didn't use my key. I pounded on the wood, the vibration rattling my teeth. The laughter inside died instantly. A heavy, suffocating silence followed, the kind of silence that exists in a courtroom right before a verdict is read. The door opened. Mark stood there, a half-empty glass of vintage Bollinger in his hand, champagne I had saved for our 5-year anniversary at the cottage. His face went from a flush of celebration to a sickly, gray pallor in a heartbeat. His eyes darted to Beatrice, who was lounging on my grandmother's velvet sofa, a stack of legal documents fanned out on the coffee table like a winning hand of poker. "Clara," Mark stammered, his voice thin and reedy, You're supposed to be in the city. You weren't supposed to come down until tomorrow." "I'm sure I wasn't," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, low, jagged, and terrifyingly calm. I pushed past him, my gaze fixed on Beatrice. She didn't look afraid. She looked annoyed, as if I were a telemarketer interrupting her favorite show. "Well," Beatrice said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, "the cat's out of the bag a little early. Mark, I told you your retreat excuse was flimsy." "I was at the bank, Mark," I said, ignoring her. I walked toward him, and he actually flinched, stepping back until his heels hit the baseboard. "The renovation fund. It's gone. $4.12 left. And a transfer to Beatrice Thorne with my forged signature. Do you want to explain that to me? Or should we wait for the police to ask the questions?" Mark's hand started to shake, the champagne sloshing against the rim of the glass. "Clara, honey, just sit down. Let's talk. It's not what it looks like. We were in trouble, big trouble. Beatrice, she had some investments go south, and they were coming for the family assets. I had to protect us." "Protect us?" I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in my throat. "You stole $300,000 of my inheritance and forged my name on a quitclaim deed to protect us? You gave my house to the woman who told me I was a temporary fixture." "It's for the best, Clara," Beatrice interrupted, standing up and smoothing her silk skirt. She walked over to the coffee table and picked up a heavy, bound folder. "We've already signed the preliminary agreement with Shoreline Developers. They're going to level this place by the end of the month. The payout will cover my debts and set Mark and his mother up for life. You are never going to do anything with this place but sink money into a sinking ship." The room tilted. Level it? The Blue Heron, with its hand-carved moldings and the porch where my grandmother taught me to paint, was going to be leveled? The betrayal felt like a physical weight on my lungs. "You can't," I whispered, my voice cracking. "The signature is a forgery. It won't hold up in court." Beatrice stepped closer, her eyes flashing with a cold, triumphant light. "That's where you're wrong, dear. Mark has been very thorough. For the last 6 months, he's been documenting your instability, the missed appointments, the forgetfulness, the emotional outbursts. He's already spoken to a family friend, a psychiatrist, who's willing to testify that you've been struggling with your grip on reality. You signed those papers, Clara. You just don't remember signing them because you were in the middle of a manic episode. Who is a judge going to believe? A grieving, unstable woman, or her devoted, concerned husband and his respected sister?" I looked at Mark. I waited for him to deny it. I waited for him to say she was lying, that he would never do something so monstrous. but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the floor, his shoulders hunched, his silence more deafening than any scream. "Mark?" I prompted, the word a jagged shard of glass in my throat. "Is that true? You told people I was mentally unfit?" He finally looked up, but there was no love in his eyes, only a desperate, cornered kind of greed. "You haven't been yourself lately, Clara. Everyone sees it. The way you obsess over this house, it's not healthy. Beatrice is just trying to help us move on. We can start over. With the money from the developers, we could buy a new place, something modern, something without all this baggage." "I am the baggage, aren't I said, the realization settling into my bones. "You didn't just want the house. You wanted to erase me so you could have the house without the problem of a wife who actually cares about things." "Don't be dramatic," Beatrice snapped. "You have an hour to pack a bag. Mark will drive you back to the city, and we can discuss the settlement later. If you make a scene, I'll call the authorities and have you removed for trespassing. As of 4 hours ago, I am the legal owner of this property." She held out a document, the filed deed. I saw the county seal. I saw my name, written in a hand that looked exactly like mine, but felt like a death warrant. "Let's go, Clara," Mark said, reaching out to touch my arm. "Let's just talk about this later, when you're calmer." I looked at his hand on my sleeve. The man I had shared my bed with, the man I had trusted with my future, was touching me with the same hand that had forged my life away. The nausea returned, but this time it was followed by a clarity so sharp it felt like a blade. I pulled my arm away with a jerk. "Don't touch me," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that filled the room. "And don't ever call me honey again." I looked at Beatrice, who was already turning back to her champagne, and then back at Mark, who was still wearing that pathetic, concerned mask. They thought they had won. They thought they had boxed me in with their forgeries and their fake psychiatric reports. "You think you've thought of everything," I said, my heart beginning to steady, the white noise in my head replaced by a singular, focused intent. "But you forgot one thing, Beatrice. You forgot who taught me how to manage this estate." "And who was that?" she asked, a smirk playing on her lips. "Your senile grandmother?" "No," I replied, a cold smile finally touching my own face. "The woman who knew exactly what kind of people the Thorns were. She didn't just leave me a house, she left me a map of every single trap you've ever set." I turned on my heel and walked out, not toward the front door, but toward the basement stairs. "Where are you going?" Mark called out, panic finally coloring his voice. "Clara, come back here!" I didn't answer. I had spent years studying the bones of this house, and I knew a secret that wasn't in any deed or any bank statement. If they wanted to play the game of who owns the heron, they were about to find out that the house had a way of protecting its own, and I was the only one who held the key to the foundation. The basement of the Blue Heron was cool and smelled of damp earth and old cedar, a scent that had always grounded me. As I descended the stairs, the sound of Mark's footsteps followed me, hesitant and heavy. He was calling my name, his voice a pathetic mix of pleading and authority, but I didn't stop until I reached the back corner, behind the heavy Victorian furnace. There was a loose stone in the foundation, one that my grandmother Rose had pointed out to me when I was 10 years old. "A house like this has secrets, Clara," she had told me, her eyes twinkling with a foresight I hadn't understood until this very second. "And a woman like you needs a place where the world can't find her." I pulled the stone away. My fingers were steady now, the trembling replaced by a crystalline, predatory focus. Behind the stone sat a small, fireproof metal box. I didn't need a key. The code was my grandmother's birthday. It clicked open, revealing a thick manila envelope and a small, leather-bound ledger. "Clara, what are you doing?" Mark was standing at the base of the stairs, the dim light casting long, distorted shadows across his face. "Just give it up. We can still make this work. We can take the money and go to the Mediterranean. You've always wanted to see Greece." I turned to him, the envelope gripped in my hand. You think this is about a vacation, Mark? You think you can buy my forgiveness with the money you stole from my grandmother's legacy? It's not stealing if it stays in the family, he shouted, his mask finally slipping, revealing the ugly, entitled core beneath. My sister was going to lose everything. I couldn't let the Thorn name be dragged through the mud because you wanted to play architect with a pile of rotting wood. The Thorn name is already mud, Mark, I said, my voice as cold as the Atlantic in February. And as for this house, you should have read the fine print of the original trust. But then again, you always were a terrible history teacher. You never did like doing the research. I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his, and headed back upstairs. In the living room, Beatrice was already on her phone, likely barking orders at the developers. She looked up as I entered, her expression one of bored contempt. "Still here?" she sighed. "I thought I told you to pack." "I did better than that," I said, tossing the leather-bound ledger onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud, splashing a few drops of her stolen champagne onto her silk blouse. "I called Julian Vance. He's been my grandmother's estate attorney for 40 years, and he's on his way here with the sheriff." Beatrice scoffed, but I saw her eyes flicker toward the ledger. "A local lawyer? Please. Our firm in the city has already vetted the title." "They vetted a forged title, Beatrice," I said, leaning over the table, my face inches from hers. "You see, Rose knew your mother. She knew exactly what kind of vultures the Thorn family produced. That's why she didn't leave me the house in a simple deed. She left it in a conditional reversionary trust." The color began to drain from Beatrice's face. "The condition is simple," I continued, my voice echoing in the quiet house. "Any attempt to transfer the property to a non-blood relative of Rose's, or any attempt to use the house as collateral for non-estate debts, triggers an immediate and irreversible transfer of all assets, including the Thorn family's remaining trust funds, into a private charity in my name. And because the quitclaim you forged was to your shell company, you didn't just fail to steal the house. You just triggered the clause that liquidates your mother's remaining inheritance." "You're lying," Beatrice hissed, her voice trembling. "That's impossible." "Read the ledger, Bea," I whispered. "It's all there. The audit trail for the $300,000 you took from my renovation fund? Julian has been tracking that transfer since the moment it hit your account. It's called wire fraud. And because you used a forged signature on a federal housing document, it's also a felony." The front door opened, and Julian Vance stepped in, flanked by 2 deputies. Julian was a man who looked like he was carved from granite, his expression stern and unimpressed by Beatrice's silk or Mark's stammering excuses. "Clara," Julian said, nodding to me, "we've secured the digital trail. The bank has already frozen the recipient account. Mr. Thorn, Miss Thorn, I suggest you stop speaking immediately." The next hour was a blur of blue lights and hushed, frantic arguments. Mark tried to grovel, falling to his knees and claiming Beatrice had coerced him, that he was doing it for us. I watched him with a detachment that surprised me. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't even feel the sting of his betrayal anymore. He was just a small, insignificant man standing in a very large, very old house that no longer recognized him. "Clara, please!" Mark cried as the deputies led him toward the door. "I love you! I was just trying to save us!" I looked at him, my hand resting on the banister of the grand staircase. "You said if I vanished, no one would notice, Mark, but it's your names that are being erased today. By tomorrow, you won't exist in my life, my bank account, or this house. You're not a husband. You're just a clerical error I've finally corrected." The silence that followed their departure was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. 8 months later, the salt air was warm as I sat on the wraparound porch of the Blue Heron. The house didn't smell like old earth anymore. It smelled of fresh white paint and the expensive, sturdy cedar I had used to reinforce the foundation. The renovation fund had been recovered through a combination of insurance and the liquidation of the Thorn Trust, a poetic justice that my grandmother would have cackled at. Beatrice was serving a 5-year sentence for fraud and embezzlement. Mark, ever the coward, had taken a plea deal that involved a suspended sentence and a permanent restraining order. He was living in a cramped studio apartment 3 states away, working a job he hated, his distinguished family name a lead weight around his neck. I picked up my coffee mug, the steam curling into the morning mist. My architectural firm was thriving, run entirely from the sun-drenched office overlooking the cliffs. I was no longer the girl who looked for soft edges in people. I had learned that the strongest structures are the ones that can weather the fiercest storms without losing their core. I looked out at the Atlantic, the waves crashing against the rocks with a timeless, rhythmic power. I was alone, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't lonely. I had my grandmother's house, my own strength, and a future that belonged to no one but me. I realized then that Beatrice was wrong about one thing. I hadn't vanished. I had simply finally appeared. Because in the end, a house is only as strong as the woman who holds the deed, and I am the only one who knows where the foundation is buried.